This particular issue is one that it was well suited for Cato, not because of some libertarian aspects, but because it brings together, as Cato does, people of different political viewpoints. The fact is, and let me say this quite early, I happen to agree with President Obama's policies, many of them. I think that Congress is wrong in not doing some of the things that the president is doing. But that doesn't change my view that the means he is using is wrong. And in fact, I believe that what he is doing in the long term is highly destabilizing and even dangerous. One of the more difficult things for me as a constitutional scholar is to watch what is happening or not happening in Congress. One of the more confusing moments of my life was watching the State of the Union address of President Obama, where he came out and told Congress that he intended to actively circumvent Congress and to start to make changes that Congress had refused to approve. And instead of hearing murmurings or even voices of opposition, what followed was rapturous applause. So you had the legislative branch applauding a president who just effectively promised to make them a non-entity. And it was a moment that bordered on self-loathing, that you would have these members of Congress who would welcome institutional obsolescence, to welcome a president who would effectively become a government unto itself. And the concern that many of us have is that the short-sighted aspect of politics, and certainly the politics today is rabid, has really blinded people to the implications of what in fact is happening. And indeed, I believe that many Democrats will rue the day that they remain silent as the American presidency changed. My greatest concern, and we testified together on this in front of the House Judiciary. My greatest concern is that our system is changing, and it's changing in a very fundamental and a very dangerous way, and it seems to be changing with virtually no notice. And it certainly seems to be changing without a debate. And the implications of those changes puts the entire future, in my view, of this country at risk, because what is changing is the aspect of the system that brings stability. Now, as all of you know, we have a tripartite system that was carefully designed by the framers. And the framers really did view the branches as sort of three bodies in orbit. And I say that quite literally. I'm working on a book right now on constitutional theory, and it looks specifically at the influence of science. And the influence of science was huge for people like James Madison, huge for people like Benjamin Franklin. They were particularly enamored with the breakthrough writings of the time by Isaac Newton. And so if you look at many of the writings of the framers, you'll see repeated references to these scientific theories. And the separation of powers comes directly out of this influence. That is, the framers viewed the essential stability of the system to be held in place by these three orbs, essentially, the three branches. Now, it's true they were all equal, but like Animal Farm, some are more equal than others. And I tell my students all the time that while we have three equal branches, the most important branch is Congress, without any question in my view. Now, I tend to be a Madisonian scholar, so you'll see different views from different folks. But it's in Congress where the magic of the Madisonian system occurs, because that's where you have this sort of black box phenomenon, where you have disparate factional interests coming into the system and sort of rattling around in these different constituencies, these different voting patterns. And what comes out, hopefully, is a majoritarian compromise. And it's that system that brings the stability to the American system. And the American system has survived remarkable challenges. And the reason for that attention to stability and factional interests was because the Congress was the Continental Congress was most interested about the instabilities that broke nations apart, and this is particularly Madison. But the other concern they had was the concentration of power. And this is one of the things that people don't seem to appreciate about separation of powers. They often talk about separation of powers as this protection of institutional interests. It was never intended, in my view, by the framers to be a protection of institutional interests, a protection of the branch interests. They always spoke of separation of powers as a protection of individual liberty. If you go back and you'll see the references that they talk about confining the powers and locking them in place, what comes out is a constant theme that they want to avoid the aggregation, the concentration of power in any one branch. And the reason is that they believe that to be a threat to liberty. They don't want any branch to have sufficient power to go it alone. So this whole separation of powers thing, and this is part of the complaint I have with how courts deal with it, it's often treated as if we're talking about the relative rights of branches instead of a protection against the concentration of power. Now, the reason they were concerned about that, by the way, is because they had just gone through that in the English system. You had, of course, the famous confrontations with James I, who insisted that he could effectively rewrite laws, that he viewed, quote, natural reason to be sufficient as he interpreted laws in a way that he felt they should naturally develop. And at the time, many English scholars and lawyers said, you can't have a legal system if it's subject to your, quote, natural reason, that you can change it naturally according to your own logic. So the framers referred to the powers of the president as confined and defined, as a direct quote, precisely to avoid the types that James I issue. Now, I also want to be clear about one other aspect about President Obama. I don't think President Obama is a tyrant. I don't even think he wants to be a tyrant. And he's not the first to abuse presidential power. I mean, let's be frank. This has been a long process. And just as the Democrats have been hypocrites, in my view, in some cases, in not speaking up against the president, there was not a lot of outcry from Republicans when President Bush exceeded his authority. So let's be frank about that. And I say that without any concern at Cato, because during the Bush administration, this was the organization that actually did call President Bush to account for exceeding his authority. So this has been a process that's been going on for some time, and that process is the increased power of the American presidency. We are developing what I referred to a couple years ago as the Uber presidency. And this certainly was actively sought during the second Bush's administration. Many people like John Yoo had made it clear that they wanted a more powerful presidency before 9/11, and 9/11 gave an opportunity for them to do precisely that.